This Thanksgiving, the Webb family campaign for governor of Virginia is giving thanks to a Father which art in heaven for granting us his peace and strength through an arduous journey through the judicial system and courts that began in the Lenten season as the lockdown began. That found early frustrations with maneuverings of culpable parties attempting to escape a judgment in a day in court and trial on the merits. Attempts to quash a legal action that had even attempted to deny our constitutional rights of standing to bring a grievance against the government on the grounds of standing, denying that a person with a sincerely held faith belief who engaged in regular devotional practices, albeit Christian, had the rights to bring that matter into a court. And in the city of Alexandria, that would easily acknowledge the rights of a non-citizen to an education or the right of a man by biology to use the ladies' room. And they call that science. But we have come a long way, Lord, a mighty long way. And though as many as 15 trained attorneys to date have not survived to bring their actions to a trial on the merits in courts where there are members of their fellow bar association to defend our basic constitutional rights for individual citizens who are not necessarily trained in the law. For businesses and places of worship, we give thanks unto the Lord, because only by his grace have we, as non-attorneys, without a license, been granted the strength to persevere and the skill to win a day in court to challenge the violations of liberty that have been meted down against all Virginians and Americans. Thanksgiving, long before Black Friday's football games and the Macy's Thanksgiving Parade in New York City, was a time of giving thanks that was elevated to a national holiday in October 1863 by a man described by a friend of my father during his last official public address as a vacillating president. A Republican president who was not just a log splitter, which provided a populist image at his nomination convention, but also an attorney who, believe it or not, never set foot in a formal law school. Abraham Lincoln was not a fancy Harvard lawyer. And although we oft recall his flowing rhetoric with wonderful phrases like our higher angels, inserted craftily into what is oft described as presidential oratory, Honest Abe had a very human side, vexed by what modern psychologists describe today as clinical depression. And that log-splitting lawyer, before being remembered as a great emancipator, actually uttered words that you can even find written in the basement of his memorial in Washington, that if he could save the Union without freeing one slave, he would do it. But sometimes when great events collide with great characters, a merciful and kind providence orders all things for our own good, for which we, at least in faith, render praise and thanks in devotion to an Our Father which art in heaven. So I have some thoughts about things for which to say thanks during an unprecedented pandemic Thanksgiving, when a nation is being said by at least one political figure to be coming together but standing 6 feet apart or more. A social distance not even observed by the early pilgrims who had developed a herd immunity to smallpox when they gathered for a feast with persons of color who had not, but who had helped them to survive through a difficult winter of their content when the dandelions of summer were dead under the snow. Matthew 26, as you know, is my favorite chapter in the Synoptic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which, for your edification, in contrast to the Johannine Gospel, recorded in the Gospel of John, a more poetic account In Matthew 26, a tale of vexing betrayal, including the infamous betrayal that was most upon the mind of Shakespeare's Richard II, when he wrote that he had 12 disciples and was betrayed by one. I have 12,000 citizens and find a friend in none. And Matthew 26 sets up the scene just before Matthew 27, when we find an innocent man being afforded his day in court, which was the setting of the sermon delivered by my godfather on the last day of Holy Week in my father's church long ago during his freshman year in Congress, after winning a surprising victory over the first African American ever elected in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Bill Gray was my daddy's son in the ministry, who, on the request of his father, was taken under the care and tutelage of my father, helping him to obtain his first job as a pastor in Montclair, New Jersey, at the St. Paul's Baptist Church, where my father, who later in his life had served as the interim pastor after his retirement from the church that he had pastored for 40 years. And that church in Montclair, St. Paul's, provided a place later for the eulogy of my mother in the year in which I graduated from college in Virginia, and completing a circle of connection at the funeral of my father. Bill Gray returned the favor to his father in the ministry, providing the eulogy, just as my father had provided the installation sermon when he finally assumed the pastorship of his father's church upon the death of his father, when his father, Reverend Gray II, went on to glory. It's kind of like the circle of life. But I mention Uncle Bill because on the last night of Holy Weekend, 1979, in which he had kept a promise, traveling every day by train from Washington to deliver a revival sermon, it was on the night of Good Friday that he completed his tale of the narrative of the Passion Play, and a sermon that he had titled The Indictments Against Jesus. And I still remember Uncle Bill in his long black flowing robe with red striping, bringing it in church with his signature raspy voice, preaching that the third indictment that he had against him was he was taking up space. The third indictment that he had against him was that he was taking up space. An interesting image. Like many a sermon, Uncle Bill's sermon certainly began in the Bible, which provided an appropriate setting for a message to church folk at Easter that he wanted to bring to church folk in keeping his promise to my father to travel from Washington each day. Even contemporaneously, though, not even yet having graduated to a fine Jesuit high school from our tiny elite private grammar school, an island of opportunity in an inner city, I could perceive the struggles of a man called to faith in Philadelphia, but popularly elected in Philadelphia to serve in Congress in Washington. The third indictment against Jesus was that he was taking up space. And amazingly, within just a few days, we would be presented clear and convincing evidence of the tensions between church and state, the secular and the sacred, with a call from federal investigators who had already begun what would become a witch hunt, essentially, an unending investigation that amounted to nothing other than a reminder that what Uncle Sam gives, Uncle Sam takes away, quite often with the same hand. But for a moment, let's go back to the Synoptic Gospels, where Uncle Bill's sermon had begun his journey in faith, in the familiar Easter setting of a town called Judea, and in the parchment pages of Matthew 27, where we find, in the King James Version, the following words: When Pilate saw that he could prevail nothing, but that rather a tumult was made, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this just person. See ye to it. My name is Paul. That's between y'all. My name is Bennett, and I ain't even in it. And the third indictment that he had against him was that he was taking up space. Sometimes when you're sitting in a pew, certain words are just going to strike you. And you may even turn to your neighbor without even a cue from the pastor and say, as the preacher is talking to me. And contemporaneously, when I heard those words from Uncle Bill, I still remember today, recorded in my mental notes of that sermon, I distinctly recall being prompted to look over and up at the cross, that old rugged cross that found a wondrous attraction for me in that time before an Easter long ago. At the time, I was a rising senior, just in the 8th grade, and but for some action presenting a greater opposing force, the die had been cast. And within just a few months, I would be standing at the halls of St. Peter, the Jesuit high school in our depressed community. They provided such a golden opportunity that high-achieving students would commute from miles away just to sit in those seats. Certainly, there would be presented new trials and new challenges, but also new opportunities. And I was on my way, I thought, to a better place. And in that moment, I was not thinking about any possible suffering, but rather was found exceedingly glad. But for a moment, rather than examining this biblical fact pattern in the setting of a judicial tribunal, let's, since we're all scientists, take a short departure from the text to view the facts like a group of conferring medical clinicians seeking to concur in an opinion, reviewing the case brought before a doctor named Pilate and his patient, who upon rigorous examination, he had declared a diagnostic finding of a just person. An intriguingly poetic allusion to be found for a deific nature amongst men in incarnate form. Not often, but on rare occasion, you may find a treating physician who may write a similar phrase in psychiatry or psychology, stating that the patient presented asymptomatic, a medical term of art in the mind of a layman that is a difference without a distinction. But for a clinician who knows through training and experience to read critically a passage in a medical report, this phrase has great significance. The patient presented asymptomatic suggests to a clinician that there is a clinical distinction between those which are denominated as symptoms or presentations of illness that require diagnostic tests, such as taking a temperature or eliciting key responses to a systematic interview, and those presentations of illness that appear through signs or those aspects of a suspected affliction that anyone can observe with the unaided eye. Make a throw out my shingle amateur diagnosis, such as the asymptomatic signs of coughing or sneezing that may indicate, but not definitively determine, that a person is afflicted with a malady requiring medical treatment, or maybe not sick at all. And in this passage, this biblical passage, we find our physician, Dr. Pilate, completing his diagnostic examination and hearing the words of the learned men who had brought him to the clinic. And he declared as a credentialed medical authority that even though within his community it appeared that the clear majority of people and learned men had seen signs of infection in their neighbor, upon a thorough examination using clinical and diagnostic tests for the symptoms that only his trained and precise instruments possessed the ability to render a clinical conclusion, he had found only a just person, presenting to him as asymptomatic. But as for his patient, the third indictment against him was that he was taking up space. And a great tumult was made. So the doctor took the water and washed his hands before the multitude. This particular passage in the Synoptic Gospels may find some resonance with contemporary events, as it records that when Pilate saw that he could prevail nothing, but that rather a great tumult was made, he took the water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this just person. And today, even within a pandemic crisis that has found throngs of protesters marching in streets, crying the calls for a justice in the many courts of man. And even according to the World Health Organization and the Centers for Disease Control, there's been found no credible medical evidence to suggest that a novel coronavirus has been established to be spread through what is called fomite transmission, or spreading through contact with a contaminated surface. The oft-repeated clinical phrase for our physicians has been to remember to wash your hands, beckoning back to the very beginnings of a pandemic crisis, as grocery store shelves were not only emptied of hand sanitizer, but also toilet paper. Even though, at least by the accounts and the scientific reports, there has been opined the possibility of stirring up an aerosolization event by the simple action of flushing the toilet. It has even been found in high concentrations in patient rooms. There has yet to be found any evidence of what our esteemed clinicians often refer to as fecal transmission from a novel coronavirus. But we are granted feelings of efficacy and empowerment in the acts of holding toilet paper and washing our hands. And yet, we have been convinced by the words of the trusted Pharisees and Sadducees that we are sick people, and presume so under penalty of criminal prosecution to be a sick people who must don masks so as to prevent our potentially lethal affliction from infecting others with simple barriers that are designed to prevent potential infectious particles that we expel through breathing events such as coughing, sneezing, talking, or sneezing, from presenting a potentially lethal affliction to others and infecting them. A truly paradoxical pandemic. It even found a collection of scientists washing their hands at the very beginning of the pandemic in a manifesto of neutrality that appeared at the end of March in the New England Journal of Medicine, where they resolved to retreat to the safety of their ivory towers and just wait until the revolution of an evolving science was over. The third indictment that he had against him was that he was taking up space. And seeing that great multitude had wrought a tumult, Dr. Pilate took the water and simply washed his hands. Yet these clinical practices of sanitization find some tangential and anecdotal connection, somewhat comically described in jurisprudence as the jurisprudential doctrine of clean hands, wherein under laws of equity, no person may enter into the kingdoms of human justice, lest he may assert upon affirmation of solemn oath under penalties of perjury that his hands are clean. which, at least in the context of criminal prosecutions, gives rise to what may in reality amount to a mere legal fiction, but is graced with the imprimatur of the therapeutically cathartic notion of a presumption of innocence. This legal fiction is often used by practicing attorneys, like the legendary criminal defense and civil rights attorney for whom I had the privilege of being a childhood protege, Raymond A. Brown, to provide a mask of exculpation, at least in the minds of his friends, for accepting generous remuneration for their services in defending the vilest criminals. And they may say, as did Uncle Ray often, remind you that no one in a human court of law is ever actually declared innocent, like the powers in the blood of the Lamb, but rather only not guilty of the charges, or of at least every specification for the element of the offense, beyond a reasonable doubt in the minds of a trier of fact, which may be a noble jurist in a bench trial or before a jury of one's peers. And for the criminal forensic experts, this eternal principle of science provides reassurance. For even our offenses, there is always found some residue, some remainder, and matter, as in Newtonian physics, can be neither created nor destroyed. And an old Southern phrase says that you can't rub against pitch without getting black. And an old Army phrase says that you can't dig yourself out a hole. And most times when we develop a hole in our outer garments, the patch we have to apply to cover it of necessity has to be just a little bit larger, providing a red scarlet letter to provide notice to all of the world that at some point, in some time, we were not always saved as we may appear. In Shakespeare's Macbeth, one character was found repeating the phrase, "Out, out, damn spot," because rub and rub though she might, she could scarce be able to remove the stain of her sin on her hands. In one Philadelphia writer's short tale, the protagonist villain could not stop the beating in his ears of a telltale heart. And one Russian literary artist even wrote an entire volume, too long for some to read, on the workings of a novel conscience when confronted with the evolutionary pressures of crime and punishment. The third indictment that he had against him was that he was taking up space. And our examining physician, Dr. Pontius Pilate, after a thorough examination of an asymptomatic patient, tendered his diagnosis, taking up the water and washing his hands. A biblical scene in the Holy Land that even for seminarians considering what is called the theological conception of soteriology, or the doctrines of salvation, tend to view this factual pattern under the jurisprudential rules of a judge casting judgment upon an offender brought into his court, rather than from the political realities that he had confronted in that setting. Viewing the great tumult wrought by the majority and his attempts to essentially save himself from their judgment by washing his feet, but not cure it. But in redemptive theology or soteriology, we find that just man before his court, proceeding to a crucifixion, no cross, no crown, providing propitiation for their crimes, even against him, granting pardon for those who knew not what they did. An interesting distinction that appears in the text of the written word. So let's bring it in, church, as the old preachers used to say. having begun a pandemic crisis at least temporarily coincident with the seasonal celebration of the Holy Feast of Lent, that found a secular authority convincing many to close the doors of the church. Non-essential business. During a time when traditionally, at least those in the Christian faith, would take the time annually to observe in sacred remembrance the holy gifts of salvation and resurrection. And at a time for those in the Judaic traditions of Moses and Abraham celebrating a time of Passover, prelude to deliverance from the lands of bondage under Pharaoh. Many, like Pontius Pilate, decided that the learned Pharisees and Sadducees and gathering masses had convinced them that it was just better to go along, because with impressive credentials of erudition, they had to know exactly what they were doing and place their faith in them and what they called the superior powers of science. And the third indictment against him was that he was taking up space. As Pontius Pilate took up the water and washed his hands. Yet now approaching the Advent season, a time, at least in Trinitarian theology, portending a great significance, if not for the Immaculate Virgin birth that some reject, as foretold by the prophets, and certainly in Revelation, in the theological sense that we learn in seminary, adding to the scriptural revelations of the aspects of the nature of God. The incarnate revelation of the aspect of his only Son, not by adoption, the heresy dismissed near the early ages of the church, or called after his conception or birth. We find a call from secular authorities to close once again the doors of the church, to refrain from family gatherings, as well as holiday celebrations of that single event. In even Aristotelian first causes, it was the sine qua non, an essential predicate for the salvation and resurrection story, because Christ could not have saved the world if he had never been born. 2,000 years ago, even though Herod had put out a decree to attempt to prevent a prophecy of old, at least he certainly believed was more than a trite superstition. Every challenge to the lockdown decrees during the Lenten celebrations have failed to survive, except one, and are on course to receive the trials of the season of Advent. And we now pause during Thanksgiving to give thanks to a Heavenly Father who has watched over us, even while alone, and who has prepared a table in the presence of our adversaries, that the gates of hell may not prevail against his holy church. The Bible teaches us to love our enemies. These litigations in both state and federal courts have provided ample evidence to endorse this proposition on more than just a deep and abiding faith, because the stain and residue of attempts to stifle our voice in the courts and to attempt to deny our constitutional rights, especially our first liberties granted in the Bill of Rights, that of free exercise, and against an established church, have built a foundation on solid ground against our adversaries who foolishly built their houses on sinking sand. And so during this time of Thanksgiving, preparing to present to the counselors representing our adversaries an impressive list of requests for that the kingdom of God will prevail. And we are confident, very confident, that an action commenced in the civil courts will provide a basis for the federal courts to convene a grand jury to hand down criminal judgments of indictment against those who violated the liberties guaranteed to all Americans and doubted the powers of God, without whose power none of these events could have ever been possible. Like the Bible says, all things are possible through Christ, who will make a way out of no way. I I ask every Christian, every conservative, every Republican, every Virginian, and every American to, like the motto of the infantry, follow me, and we shall overcome. Honest. This advertisement